In the pitch-black skies over the Pacific during World War II, Japanese bomber crews thought they owned the night. They flew their missions under the cover of darkness, believing themselves invisible, untouchable, safe from the eyes of American fighters. These pilots had grown confident through months of successful raids, their bombers returning home again and again without encountering serious resistance after sunset. The night was their shield, their fortress, their guarantee of survival. But on one terrible evening in the summer of 1945, something changed forever. Four massive Japanese bombers vanished from the sky in just 80 minutes, plucked from the darkness by an invisible predator they never saw coming. The crews didn't even have time to send distress signals. They simply disappeared, erased from existence by a hunter they refused to believe could exist. The Americans had unleashed a new kind of warrior into the night sky, a massive twin-engine fighter painted black as death itself, equipped with technology that seemed like magic and weapons that delivered destruction with surgical precision. The Japanese command had received reports about this aircraft, whispers from surviving pilots who claimed to have glimpsed something enormous stalking them through the clouds, but the high command dismissed these stories as panic and imagination. They could not accept that the Americans had created a night fighter so advanced, so deadly, so completely superior to anything in their arsenal. That refusal to believe would cost them dearly, and the events of that single night would become a turning point in the air war over the Pacific, demonstrating that American technology and training had reached a level the Japanese military could no longer match or even comprehend. The Pacific War had begun with Japanese forces dominating both day and night operations across the vast ocean theater. Their bombers, particularly the Mitsubishi G4M bomber known to Americans as the Betty, had conducted countless raids against Allied positions, ships, and bases throughout the early years of the conflict. These aircraft were designed for long range and heavy payload, capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away and returning to base before dawn. Japanese pilots had developed sophisticated tactics for night bombing, using the darkness to approach their targets undetected, release their deadly cargo, and escape before enemy forces could respond effectively. For a long time, this strategy worked brilliantly. American forces struggled to counter these night attacks, lacking both the technology and the training necessary to intercept bombers operating under cover of total darkness. Early attempts at night interception relied on luck, searchlights, and the hope that a fighter pilot might somehow spot an enemy aircraft against the stars. These methods proved almost completely ineffective, and Japanese bomber crews grew increasingly bold, sometimes flying their missions at relatively low altitudes, knowing that the Americans below could hear them but could not see them or stop them. The psychological impact of these night raids was enormous, keeping Allied personnel in a constant state of anxiety, unable to rest or recover properly because the threat could arrive at any moment. The Japanese military command understood this advantage and exploited it ruthlessly, using their night bombing capability to compensate for growing disadvantages in other areas of the war. However, what they did not know was that American engineers and military planners had been working frantically to develop a solution, pouring resources into creating an aircraft and radar system capable of turning the tables completely. The project that would produce the P-61 Black Widow had been underway since 1940, driven by urgent requests from commanders in the field who desperately needed a way to protect their forces and installations from nocturnal attack. The development process was long, complicated, and filled with challenges that seemed almost impossible to overcome. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow emerged from one of the most ambitious aircraft development programs of the entire war. When the United States Army Air Forces issued requirements for a purpose-built night fighter in 1940, they were asking for something that had never been successfully created before. The aircraft would need to be large enough to carry advanced radar equipment and a crew of 3, yet maneuverable enough to engage enemy bombers in combat. It would need enough firepower to destroy targets quickly and decisively, yet stable enough to serve as a radar platform. It would need sufficient range to patrol vast areas of ocean and jungle, yet fast enough to catch bombers trying to escape. These requirements seemed contradictory, almost impossible to satisfy in a single airframe, but Northrop Aircraft took on the challenge with determination and innovation. The design that emerged was unlike anything else flying at the time. The P-61 was enormous for a fighter, with a wingspan of over 66 feet and a length of nearly 50 feet. It weighed more than 20,000 pounds empty and could reach almost 38,000 pounds fully loaded. This massive size was necessary to accommodate the SCR-720 radar system in the nose, along with 4 20mm cannons mounted in the belly and initially 4 50 caliber machine guns in a dorsal turret. The aircraft was powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engines, each producing 2,000 horsepower, giving the Black Widow a top speed of over 360 miles per hour. The entire aircraft was painted in glossy black paint that absorbed light and made it nearly invisible against the night sky. The design incorporated several innovative features including spoilers instead of ailerons for roll control and a distinctive twin-boom layout that gave the pilot excellent visibility. The development process was not smooth, with numerous technical problems emerging during testing, particularly concerning the dorsal turret which created dangerous buffeting and was eventually removed from most production aircraft. Nevertheless, by mid-1944, the P-61 began reaching operational squadrons in the Pacific, Europe, and the Mediterranean theaters. The crews who would fly the P-61 Black Widow into combat required specialized training, unlike anything provided to conventional fighter pilots. Each aircraft carried 3 men: a pilot who controlled the aircraft and operated the fixed forward-firing cannons, a radar operator who sat behind and below the pilot managing the complex SCR-720 system, and a gunner who initially operated the dorsal turret before that position evolved into a general observer role. These 3 men had to function as a perfectly coordinated team, communicating constantly and trusting each other completely because night combat allowed no margin for error or confusion. The pilot had to learn to fly entirely on instruments for extended periods, maintaining precise altitude and heading in total darkness, while simultaneously preparing for sudden violent maneuvers when targets were detected. The radar operator had to master the complicated SCR-720 system, interpreting the green phosphor scope displays to distinguish real targets from ground clutter, weather formations, and false returns. This required intense concentration and significant experience because the early radar systems were temperamental and difficult to use effectively. The gunner observer served as an extra set of eyes, watching for visual contacts and helping the pilot maintain situational awareness during the confusion of combat. Training for P-61 crews took months and emphasized teamwork above all else. Pilots practiced formation flying at night, learning to trust their instruments completely even when their inner ear and instincts screamed that they were in a bank or dive. Radar operators spent hundreds of hours staring at scopes, learning to recognize the subtle differences between various types of targets and environmental interference. The crews flew practice intercepts against friendly aircraft, developing the communication patterns and coordination necessary to guide their pilot into firing position based solely on information from the radar. This training was conducted primarily in the United States before crews deployed overseas, but it continued in theater as squadrons developed their own tactics and techniques based on actual combat experience. The learning curve was steep, and early missions often ended without any contact simply because crews were still mastering their equipment and procedures. However, as experience accumulated, the effectiveness of P-61 units increased dramatically. When the Black Widow arrived in the Pacific Theater during the summer of 1944, the tactical situation favored Japanese night operations significantly. American forces had established bases across the Pacific Island chains, creating a network of airfields, supply depots, and radar stations that stretched from Australia to the Marianas. However, these installations remained vulnerable to night attack because existing fighter aircraft like the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt, while excellent in daylight combat, lacked the specialized equipment and crew configuration necessary for effective night interception. Japanese bombers took full advantage of this weakness, conducting raids against American positions on New Guinea, the Philippines, and later the Marianas as those islands fell to Allied forces. These attacks caused significant damage and casualties, destroying aircraft on the ground, damaging facilities, and disrupting operations. More importantly, they forced American personnel to remain in shelters and on alert throughout the night, degrading combat effectiveness through exhaustion and stress. The Japanese employed several types of bombers for these missions, including the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, the Mitsubishi Kai-67 Hiryu, and occasionally the Nakajima J1N Gecko, which itself served as a night fighter. These aircraft typically operated individually or in small groups, approaching their targets at medium altitude, dropping their bombs, and departing quickly before defenses could respond. The tactics were simple but effective given the limitations of American night defensive capabilities at the time. When the first P-61 squadrons became operational in the Pacific, they faced numerous challenges beyond simply finding and destroying enemy aircraft. The vast distances involved meant that radar coverage was limited, and enemy bombers could approach from many directions. Weather conditions, particularly tropical storms and heavy cloud cover, made radar interpretation even more difficult. Additionally, the early missions revealed that the Black Widow, despite its impressive capabilities, had limitations including a relatively slow rate of climb compared to day fighters and the complexity of operating the radar system under combat conditions. Squadron commanders had to develop entirely new tactical doctrines for employing their aircraft, determining optimal patrol patterns, altitude bands, and coordination with ground-based radar stations. Among the P-61 units that deployed to the Pacific, the 418 Night Fighter Squadron would become one of the most successful and renowned. This squadron arrived in the theater during early 1945, equipped with the latest P-61B model Black Widows and staffed with crews who had completed extensive training in the United States. The squadron was assigned to support operations in the Philippines and later the Ryukyu Islands as American forces advanced closer to the Japanese home islands. The men of the 418 came from diverse backgrounds across America, brought together by their selection for night fighter duty and their completion of the demanding training program. They ranged from experienced pilots who had transitioned from other aircraft types to fresh crews on their first combat assignment. What united them was a dedication to mastering their difficult and dangerous mission, and a growing confidence in their aircraft and equipment despite its novelty. The squadron operated from various bases as the campaign progressed, often working from hastily prepared airstrips that had been captured only weeks earlier. Living conditions were primitive, with crews sleeping in tents, dealing with tropical heat and rain, and enduring the ever-present insects and occasional enemy harassment. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the Black Widows operational despite shortages of parts and the challenging environment that caused rapid wear on engines and systems. The squadron's mission was straightforward in concept but incredibly difficult in execution. Patrol designated areas during hours of darkness, intercept and destroy any enemy aircraft detected, and prevent those aircraft from attacking American forces and installations. Initially, contact with the enemy was sporadic. Some nights the crews would patrol for hours without detecting anything, landing tired and frustrated as dawn broke. Other nights they would track contacts that turned out to be friendly aircraft or radar phantoms. However, as the crews accumulated experience and refined their techniques, successful interceptions became more frequent. The first confirmed victory, achieved by a 418 Night Fighter Squadron P-61, came after several weeks of fruitless patrols that had tested the patience and determination of the crews. A radar operator named Dale Haberman picked up a contact approaching the American base at medium altitude, tracking it smoothly despite some ground clutter interference. He guided his pilot, a lieutenant from Texas named Larry Smith, through a series of turns that brought the Black Widow into position approximately 1,000 feet behind and slightly below the target. As they closed to within a few hundred yards, Smith caught a visual glimpse of the target, confirming it as a Japanese bomber, likely a Betty. He squeezed the trigger and the 420mm cannons erupted, sending a stream of explosive shells into the enemy aircraft. The bomber staggered, caught fire, and fell away toward the ocean below, marking the squadron's first kill. This initial success electrified the unit and validated their training and tactics. More victories followed as the squadron refined its procedures, and the crews developed an almost instinctive understanding of how to employ their aircraft and equipment effectively. Each successful intercept followed a similar pattern. Ground controllers or the aircraft's own radar would detect a contact, the crew would maneuver to intercept, the radar operator would guide the pilot through whatever turns were necessary to position behind the target, and finally the pilot would close to firing range and deliver a burst from the cannons. The entire sequence often took 10 to 20 minutes from initial detection to destruction, requiring sustained concentration and precise coordination. The crews learned to recognize the different radar signatures of various Japanese aircraft types, helping them prioritize threats and predict enemy behavior. They discovered that most Japanese bomber crews had no idea they were being tracked until the first shells struck their aircraft, and even then many seemed confused about where the attack was coming from. The Japanese simply had no effective counter to the P-61's radar-directed attacks, lacking both the detection equipment to know they were being hunted and the night fighting training to respond effectively. As the 418's victory count climbed, the squadron developed a reputation for effectiveness that boosted morale throughout the unit and demonstrated to higher command that the investment in night fighters was paying significant dividends. Despite growing evidence that American forces had developed an effective night fighter capability, Japanese military intelligence and command structures struggled to accept and respond to this reality. Surviving bomber crews who managed to return from missions began reporting increasingly disturbing encounters with what they described as a large twin-engine aircraft that appeared without warning in the darkness. Some crews reported seeing brief glimpses of a massive black shape before their aircraft was torn apart by cannon fire. Others described being attacked from behind with no warning whatsoever, the first indication of danger being the impact of shells against their aircraft. A few crews even reported detecting the presence of something stalking them through the night, sensing rather than seeing the predator, and taking evasive action that sometimes allowed them to escape. However, these reports were often dismissed by intelligence officers and commanders who found them difficult to believe. The idea that the Americans had created an aircraft capable of finding and tracking targets in total darkness seemed too advanced, too far beyond Japanese technical capabilities for them to accept as real. Some officers suggested that the losses were due to anti-aircraft fire, even though the attack patterns clearly indicated aerial combat. Others proposed that American pilots had simply gotten lucky, stumbling across Japanese bombers by chance. Still others blamed the bomber crews themselves, suggesting that poor discipline or navigation errors had led to their losses. This denial stemmed partly from genuine skepticism about American technical achievements, but also from a cultural reluctance to acknowledge that the enemy had gained a decisive advantage in any area of combat. The Japanese military had built its identity on fighting spirit and warrior tradition, believing that dedication and courage could overcome material disadvantages. Accepting that American technology had rendered their night bombing tactics obsolete would require admitting a fundamental shift in the balance of power, something many officers were psychologically unable to do. Additionally, Japanese intelligence gathering capabilities had degraded significantly by 1945, making it difficult to obtain accurate information about American equipment and capabilities. Captured aircraft were rarely available for study, and the few American prisoners who might have knowledge of night fighter operations were not forthcoming with information. By the summer of 1945, American forces had captured Okinawa and were using the island as a major staging base for operations against the Japanese home islands. This forward position put American air power within easy striking distance of targets throughout southern Japan and created a serious threat to Japanese air and sea operations in the region. In response, Japanese commanders planned a series of retaliatory raids against American installations on Okinawa, hoping to damage facilities, destroy aircraft on the ground, and demonstrate that Japanese forces still had the capability to strike back despite their deteriorating strategic position. These raids would be conducted primarily at night, using the tactics that had served Japanese forces well earlier in the war. 4 heavy bombers were selected for a coordinated mission targeting different areas of the American base complex on Okinawa. The aircraft, all Mitsubishi G4M Betas from experienced units, would approach from different directions, strike their assigned targets, and withdraw independently, making it difficult for American defenses to coordinate a response. The crews were briefed on the mission with confidence, assured by their commanders that night operations remained a relatively safe way to attack heavily defended targets. Some of the pilots had flown dozens of previous missions and considered themselves experts in nocturnal attack techniques. They knew the Americans had anti-aircraft guns and searchlights, but these defenses had proven largely ineffective in the past. There was mention during the briefing of reports about a new American night fighter, but the intelligence officer who brought it up was vague about details, and several of the more experienced pilots expressed skepticism that such an aircraft could pose a serious threat. The general attitude among the crews was one of professional concern but not significant worry. They respected the danger inherent in any combat mission but felt confident in their aircraft, their training, and their experience. As darkness fell on the appointed evening, the 4 bombers taxied out and took off into the night sky, climbing to their assigned altitude and setting course for Okinawa. The crews settled into their positions, pilots monitoring engines and instruments, bombardiers preparing their weapons, gunners scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. The flight to the target area would take several hours, and the crews fell into the routine of a long-over-water mission. Alert but not tense, confident but not careless, on Okinawa, the 418 Night Fighter Squadron had received intelligence about possible Japanese bomber activity, and several P-61 crews were placed on alert as darkness fell. Among them was a Black Widow piloted by Lieutenant Dale Haberman, with radar operator Captain Paul Smith and observer Corporal Eugene Mercer forming his crew. This particular team had achieved 6 confirmed victories together over the previous months and had developed an almost telepathic level of coordination. They knew each other's voices, communication styles, and thought processes so well that they could operate with minimal verbal exchanges, each man anticipating what the others needed. As the evening progressed, ground controllers began picking up radar contacts to the north and west of Okinawa, multiple targets approaching at medium altitude on courses that suggested hostile intent. Haberman and his crew were scrambled along with 2 other P-61s, launching into the darkness and climbing toward their assigned patrol sector. The Black Widow rose smoothly through the tropical night air, Haberman trimming the aircraft and settling into a steady cruise, while Smith powered up the radar system and began scanning the sky ahead. Mercer checked the ammunition loads and settled into his observer position, his eyes already adapting to the darkness, ready to pick up any visual contacts. Ground control vectored the 3 P-61s toward the general area of the contacts, spreading them across the likely approach paths to provide maximum coverage. Haberman's aircraft took the western sector, flying a racetrack pattern at 15,000 feet, Smith's radar sweeping back and forth across a 90-degree arc ahead of the aircraft. For the first 30 minutes, they detected nothing but the other friendly fighters and occasional ground returns from the islands below. The crew maintained discipline, communicating only when necessary, conserving their night vision and mental energy for the moment when a genuine target appeared. Then, just after midnight, Smith's radar scope showed a clear return at 25 miles range, bearing 285 degrees, altitude estimated at 12,000 feet. The contact was moving toward Okinawa at approximately 200 miles per hour, consistent with a Japanese bomber. Smith calmly called out the information to Haberman, who immediately turned toward the intercept heading and began a shallow descent to position below and behind the target. As Haberman maneuvered the P-61 toward the radar contact, Smith provided a steady stream of updates, his voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through all three crew members. The range decreased steadily as the Black Widow closed on the unsuspecting Japanese bomber from behind and below, the ideal attack position. At 5 miles, Smith refined his altitude estimate and Haberman adjusted slightly, maintaining perfect position. At 2 miles, Haberman throttled back slightly to control his closure rate, not wanting to overshoot the target before achieving visual contact. At 1 mile, Mercer began scanning intensely through the darkness ahead, searching for any glimpse of the enemy aircraft. At half a mile, Haberman also began picking up visual cues, a slightly darker shape against the stars, a subtle shadow that resolved gradually into the twin-engine shape of a Betty bomber. The Japanese crew had no idea death was approaching from behind, no warning that they had been tracked across miles of ocean and were now lined up perfectly in the sights of 4 20mm cannons. Haberman closed to 300 yards, confirming his target identification and verifying that no friendly aircraft were in the area. He armed his guns, centered the pipper on the bomber's fuselage and squeezed the trigger. The Black Widow shuddered as all 4 cannons fired simultaneously, sending a devastating stream of explosive shells across the short distance into the Betty. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Shells tore through the bomber's thin aluminum skin, exploding inside the fuselage, shredding control cables, rupturing fuel tanks, and killing crew members. The Betty staggered, trailing fire from its starboard engine and fuselage. Haberman fired a second burst, ensuring the kill, and watched as the bomber entered a steep dive, flames spreading rapidly across the wing and fuselage. Within seconds, the aircraft broke apart under the stress of the dive and the structural damage, tumbling toward the ocean as a mass of burning debris. From detection to destruction, the engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes. The Japanese crew never transmitted a distress call, never even knew they were under attack until the shells began hitting their aircraft. Haberman reported the kill to ground control and immediately returned to his patrol pattern, knowing that the intelligence reports had indicated multiple inbound targets. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, more Japanese bombers were approaching Okinawa, and the night was far from over. Within 20 minutes of the first kill, Smith picked up another radar contact, this one approaching from a slightly different direction at 14,000 feet. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Haberman turned to intercept, Smith guided him through the approach, the range closed steadily, visual contact was achieved, and the cannons spoke their deadly message. This second bomber, another Betty, burned and fell just like the first, its crew never realizing what had killed them until the moment of impact. 2 down in less than 30 minutes, and the crew was already searching for the third target that intelligence had predicted. Ground control reported a contact to the northwest, and Haberman turned in that direction, climbing slightly to position himself advantageously. However, before they could intercept that target, one of the other P-61s from the 418 Squadron, piloted by Lieutenant James Bradford, reported engaging and destroying a bomber in the northern sector. The third kill of the night had been achieved by a different crew, but the overall result was the same. Another Japanese bomber erased from the sky without ever delivering its payload against American installations. The coordinated patrol pattern established by the squadron was working perfectly, creating an invisible net through which Japanese bombers could not pass safely. Haberman was vectored toward the fourth and final contact, which ground control was tracking as it approached from the west. This bomber appeared to be at a lower altitude than the others, perhaps attempting to sneak in under radar coverage. But the American ground-based radar systems were too sophisticated to be fooled by such simple tactics. Haberman descended to 10,000 feet and set up an intercept course, Smith once again providing precise guidance as the Black Widow closed on its unsuspecting prey. The engagement developed exactly like the previous two, with the P-61 positioning perfectly behind and slightly below the target, closing to lethal range and delivering a burst of cannon fire that doomed the Japanese aircraft. This third Betty for Haberman's crew, the fourth overall for the squadron that night, caught fire immediately and went down in flames, adding to the growing toll of Japanese bombers that would never return home. When Haberman's P-61 finally landed back at base as dawn was breaking, the entire squadron realized they had accomplished something extraordinary. 4 Japanese bombers destroyed in a span of approximately 80 minutes, without a single American casualty, without a single bomb landing on American installations, without the enemy even understanding what had happened to them. The ground crews swarmed over the Black Widows, examining the gun barrels that were still hot from firing, counting the expended ammunition, and congratulating the air crews who climbed stiffly from their cockpits after hours in the air. The intelligence officers immediately began debriefing the crews, documenting every detail of the engagements for analysis and reporting. The kills were confirmed not only by the aircrew reports, but also by ground-based radar operators who had watched the contacts disappear from their scopes at the moment the pilots reported firing. Additionally, some forward positions had observed the bombers burning as they fell into the ocean, providing further confirmation. The squadron commander recognized immediately that this night's work represented a significant milestone in the Pacific Air War, demonstrating conclusively that American night fighter capabilities had reached a level where Japanese nocturnal operations were no longer viable. He drafted a detailed report for higher headquarters, emphasizing not just the tactical success but the strategic implications. If P-61 squadrons could consistently achieve this level of effectiveness, Japanese forces would be denied the cover of darkness that had previously allowed them to conduct operations with relative impunity. The 4 bomber crews that had taken off from their bases in Japan that evening never returned, and their fate remained unknown to Japanese commanders for some time. When they failed to report back, search efforts were initiated, but no trace of the aircraft or crews was ever found. The bombers had simply vanished into the Pacific night, leaving no survivors to tell what had happened, no evidence to examine, no information to help Japanese intelligence understand the new threat they faced. From the Japanese perspective, 4 experienced crews and 4 valuable aircraft had been lost for no apparent reason, a mysterious disaster that defied explanation. The loss of 4 bombers in a single night, while significant in itself, represented only one data point in a larger pattern that Japanese commanders could no longer ignore. Throughout the summer of 1945, losses of aircraft conducting night operations had been climbing steadily, reaching levels that threatened the viability of continuing such missions at all. The 418 Night Fighter Squadron alone would eventually claim more than 40 aerial victories by the end of the war, and other American night fighter units operating throughout the Pacific achieved similar success rates. Japanese bomber units found themselves unable to conduct effective operations after dark, with loss rates climbing above 50% on some missions. Crews that had previously flown with confidence now approached night missions with dread, knowing that they might encounter the invisible American hunters at any moment. Some pilots began refusing orders or developing mysterious illnesses that kept them grounded, unable to face the psychological stress of flying into darkness, knowing that something they could not see might be stalking them. The morale impact rippled through entire air groups, affecting even daylight operations as units lost their most experienced personnel to the night fighter threat. Japanese commanders finally began taking the P-61 threat seriously, but by then it was too late to develop effective countermeasures. Japan lacked the radar technology and industrial capacity to create equivalent night fighters, and the few attempts to develop counter-tactics proved ineffective against the sophisticated American aircraft and well-trained crews. Some units tried flying at very low altitude to avoid radar detection, but this increased fuel consumption, reduced range, and made the bombers vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Others attempted to use fighter escorts, but Japanese night fighter capabilities were limited, and the fighters themselves often fell victim to the P-61s. A few missions tried to overwhelm American defenses with large formations, but coordinating multiple aircraft in darkness proved difficult, and the losses were even higher than for individual bombers. Ultimately, Japanese forces largely abandoned night bombing operations in the final months of the war, ceding control of the night sky to American forces completely. This represented a major strategic victory for the Allies, as it forced Japanese aircraft to operate during daylight when they faced overwhelming American fighter superiority, or to remain grounded entirely. The success of the P-61 Black Widow resulted from the integration of several technological advances that, when combined, created a weapons system far more capable than the sum of its parts. The SCR-720 airborne intercept radar was perhaps the most critical component, representing years of development in electronics and microwave technology. This system could detect aircraft-sized targets at ranges up to 5 miles in optimal conditions, providing bearing and approximate altitude information that allowed the radar operator to guide the pilot into attack position. The radar operated on a frequency of 10,000 MHz with a power output of around 50 kilowatts, using a parabolic dish antenna that could be aimed in azimuth and elevation. The scope display showed returns as bright spots on a dark screen, with range indicated by the distance from the center and bearing shown by angular position. Interpreting these displays required significant training and experience, but skilled operators could extract remarkable amounts of information from the green glowing images. The radar was complemented by the aircraft's armament, 4 M220mm cannons mounted in the belly in a slightly staggered arrangement that allowed all four to fire forward without interference. Each cannon was fed by a 200-round drum, giving the P-61 800 rounds total of devastating firepower. The 20mm high-explosive incendiary rounds could tear through the light structure of Japanese bombers with ease, and a 1 to 2 second burst was usually sufficient to destroy or critically damage a target. The cannons were electrically fired and synchronized, with all four weapons discharging simultaneously when the pilot pressed the trigger. This concentration of fire created a cone of destruction that was difficult to miss once the pilot had positioned properly. The aircraft itself provided a stable platform for both the radar and weapons, with handling characteristics that pilots generally praised despite its large size. The twin R-2800 engines were reliable and powerful, capable of sustained operation at high power settings without overheating. The spoiler-based roll control system took some getting used to, but provided good response once pilots adapted their technique. The spacious cockpit and crew compartment allowed the three-man crew to work efficiently without cramping, and the aircraft's long range meant that crews could patrol for hours without refueling. The success of the P-61 program depended entirely on the quality and dedication of the men who flew and maintained these sophisticated aircraft. The pilots came from diverse backgrounds but shared certain characteristics that made them suitable for the unique demands of night fighting. They needed exceptional instrument flying skills, as much of their time would be spent controlling the aircraft solely by reference to gauges and indicators in total darkness. They needed patience and discipline, as night fighting involved long periods of uneventful patrol punctuated by brief moments of intense action. They needed to trust their equipment and their crew completely, accepting guidance from the radar operator even when their own eyes told them nothing was there. Many P-61 pilots had previous experience in other aircraft types and had volunteered for night fighter duty, attracted by the challenge and the opportunity to operate cutting-edge equipment. The radar operators were often the most technically skilled members of the crew, many having received extensive electronics training before joining the Air Force. They needed to understand not just how to operate the radar but how it worked, so they could troubleshoot problems in flight and adapt to different conditions. They needed spatial reasoning abilities to convert the two-dimensional radar scope displays into a three-dimensional understanding of where the target was relative to their own aircraft. They needed communication skills to convey complex information clearly and concisely to the pilot during the stress of combat. The best radar operators developed an almost instinctive feel for their equipment, recognizing patterns and anomalies instantly and guiding their pilot with complete confidence. The third crew member, initially a gunner and later an observer, served multiple roles including additional visual lookout, radio communication, and general situational awareness. While this position received less attention than pilot or radar operator, it was nevertheless important for crew coordination and mission success. On the ground, hundreds of maintenance personnel, armorers, radar technicians, and support staff worked around the clock to keep the P-61s operational. These men faced constant challenges from harsh tropical conditions, limited parts supplies, and the complexity of maintaining advanced electronic systems in primitive field conditions. Yet they achieved remarkable readiness rates through skill and determination. The introduction of effective airborne radar and purpose-built night fighters fundamentally changed aerial warfare tactics and forced military planners to reconsider assumptions about air operations. Before the P-61 and similar aircraft, night had been considered a sanctuary where bombers could operate with relative safety. Air defenses relied primarily on searchlights, sound locators, and luck to engage nighttime attackers. The small number of night fighter aircraft that existed were limited to visual interceptions on bright moonlit nights, and even then success rates were low. The P-61 changed this calculus completely by making darkness irrelevant to the hunter even while the hunted remained blind. This asymmetry created a tactical situation where American night fighters could engage Japanese bombers at will, choosing the time and position of attack while the enemy had no effective means of detecting or countering them. The implications extended beyond the immediate tactical advantages. Japanese forces found themselves forced to choose between conducting operations during daylight when they faced overwhelming American fighter superiority, or abandoning air operations entirely in many areas. Neither option was acceptable, but continuing night operations in the face of catastrophic losses was equally impossible. This dilemma contributed to the rapid collapse of Japanese air power in the final months of the war, as units were ground down through attrition without achieving meaningful results. The The success of the P-61 also influenced post-war aircraft development, demonstrating that radar-equipped night fighters and all-weather interceptors represented the future of air defense. The technology and tactics developed for the Black Widow would inform the design of jet-powered night fighters like the F-89 Scorpion, and eventually lead to the modern concept of the all-weather multi-role fighter that can operate effectively regardless of lighting or weather conditions. The three-man crew concept would largely give way to two-seat configurations as radar technology improved and automation reduced operator workload. But the basic idea of a radar-equipped interceptor with specialized crew training remained central to air defense doctrine for decades. Behind the statistics and tactical analyses were real human beings who experienced the terror and triumph of night combat in the Pacific. Lieutenant Dale Haberman, the pilot who achieved 3 kills on that famous night, later recalled the strange disconnection between the intensity of combat and the surreal calm of flying through darkness before and after engagements. He described how the night sky could be perfectly peaceful one moment and then erupt in violence the next, how the tracers from his cannons seemed to float toward the target in slow motion even though they were traveling at tremendous speed, and how the burning Japanese bombers fell away like shooting stars in reverse. He spoke about the weight of knowing that each kill represented human lives ended, Japanese crews who never saw what killed them and never had a chance to defend themselves. Despite his professional pride in his skill and effectiveness, Haberman struggled with the moral dimensions of such one-sided combat. Captain Paul Smith, his radar operator, had a different perspective shaped by his technical role. For him, combat was largely an abstract exercise conducted via the radar scope, watching the mathematics of pursuit and interception play out in real time. He described the intense concentration required to interpret the radar returns, filtering out ground clutter and atmospheric interference to maintain lock on genuine targets. He recalled the satisfaction of guiding his pilot to a perfect firing position, the sudden disappearance of the radar return when the target was destroyed, and the immediate transition to searching for the next contact. Smith emphasized the teamwork aspect, noting that every successful interception required perfect coordination between all 3 crew members, and how even small miscommunications could cause targets to escape. Corporal Eugene Mercer, the observer on Haberman's crew, described the strange experience of being somewhat peripheral to the actual interception process while still being vital to crew effectiveness. His job was to maintain the broader picture, keep track of communications from ground control, watch for other aircraft in the area, and provide an extra set of eyes to catch visual contacts that the pilot might miss while focusing on instruments. He recalled the tension of approaching a target, never quite sure if it would turn out to be enemy or friendly until the pilot achieved visual identification, and the relief mixed with excitement when kills were confirmed. Reconstructing Japanese perspectives on the P-61 threat is challenging because relatively few records survived the war and even fewer personnel who encountered the aircraft lived to describe their experiences. However, some fragmentary evidence exists from interrogations of captured airmen, recovered documents, and post-war interviews with Japanese veterans. These sources reveal that Japanese aircrew understood they faced a serious and growing threat from American night fighters, even if they did not always know specific details about the P-61 itself. Survivors described a growing sense of dread associated with night missions, knowing that they might be stalked by an invisible enemy at any moment. Some crews reported sensing they were being followed before actual attacks commenced, perhaps picking up on subtle vibrations or sounds from the nearby P-61, or simply experiencing the psychological intuition that comes from being hunted. Others described attacks that came without any warning whatsoever, the first indication being the impact of cannon shells on their aircraft. The survivors uniformly reported that there was no effective defense once an attack began, as the American aircraft positioned behind and below where Japanese dorsal gunners could not bring their weapons to bear, and the attacks happened so quickly that evasive maneuvers were impossible. Japanese commanders recognized the threat intellectually but struggled to develop effective countermeasures due to technological limitations and resource constraints. Some efforts were made to equip bombers with rearward-looking radar warning receivers, but these systems were primitive, unreliable, and produced many false alarms that crews learned to ignore. Attempts to provide fighter escorts for night bombers failed because Japanese night fighters like the Nakajima J-1N Gecko lacked the performance and radar capability to effectively counter the P-61. Some tactical changes were implemented, including varying altitudes and approach routes, using weather for concealment and reducing the frequency of missions, but these measures only reduced losses slightly without solving the fundamental problem. By the final months of the war, many Japanese air units had effectively stopped conducting night missions entirely, recognizing that the losses outweighed any possible gains. As summer 1945 progressed toward the eventual Japanese surrender in August, the P-61 squadrons continued their work with growing effectiveness and decreasing Japanese resistance. The 418 Night Fighter Squadron and its sister units achieved air superiority in their operating areas so complete that enemy contacts became increasingly rare. Some nights the P-61s would patrol for hours without detecting any enemy activity at all, as Japanese forces husbanded their remaining aircraft for the expected invasion of the home islands. When contacts did occur, they were usually dealt with quickly and efficiently by the now veteran American crews who had refined their tactics through months of combat experience. The squadron accumulated victories against a variety of Japanese aircraft types, including not just bombers, but also some fighters and reconnaissance aircraft that ventured into American-controlled airspace after dark. Each kill was documented, analyzed, and added to the growing body of knowledge about night fighter operations. The crews themselves had evolved from nervous novices into confident professionals who understood their aircraft, their equipment, and their mission thoroughly. Some pilots and radar operators had achieved 5 or more victories, qualifying as night fighter aces, a rare distinction given the smaller number of opportunities compared to daylight fighter pilots. The ground crews had become expert at maintaining the complex P-61s under field conditions, developing workarounds for parts shortages and techniques for rapid repair of battle damage. The entire squadron functioned as a well-oiled machine, capable of launching aircraft within minutes of receiving alert orders and sustaining operations throughout the night if required. As news of Japan's impending surrender spread through the Pacific Theater in early August following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the night fighter squadron stood ready to continue operations if necessary, but also began to contemplate what peace would mean for them. Many crew members had spent over a year in the Pacific flying dangerous missions in harsh conditions and were ready to go home. Others worried about whether their specialized skills would be valued in the post-war military or if night fighter squadrons would be disbanded as unnecessary in peacetime. The P-61 Black Widow's combat career was relatively brief, spanning from mid-1944 to the end of the war in August 1945, yet its impact on aerial warfare was profound and lasting. The aircraft and its crews demonstrated conclusively that radar-equipped night fighters could dominate nocturnal air combat, establishing air superiority even in total darkness. This capability would become essential in the Cold War era when the threat of Soviet bomber attack required around-the-clock air defense coverage regardless of weather or lighting conditions. The technological lessons learned from the P-61 program influenced the development of subsequent night fighters and all-weather interceptors, including the Northrop F-89 Scorpion, which incorporated many design features pioneered on the Black Widow. The tactical doctrines developed by P-61 squadrons, including crew coordination procedures, radar employment techniques, and patrol patterns, formed the foundation for air defense operations that continued for decades. The training programs established for night fighter crews became models for training specialist aircrew in other roles requiring multi-person coordination and advanced technology operation. Beyond these tangible legacies, the P-61 represented an important milestone in the application of electronics and radar to aerial warfare, demonstrating that technology could overcome natural limitations like darkness and create decisive tactical advantages. The aircraft showed that success in modern warfare would increasingly depend on sensors, electronics, and information processing rather than just speed, maneuverability, and pilot skill, a trend that has only accelerated in the decades since World War II. For the Japanese military, the P-61 represented a harsh lesson about the consequences of falling behind in technology development and the importance of maintaining air superiority across all conditions. The inability to counter American night fighters contributed directly to Japan's loss of air superiority in the Pacific and the eventual defeat. For the American crews who flew the Black Widow, the aircraft represented a source of professional pride and a connection to an important chapter in aviation history. Many remained in contact with their fellow crew members for decades after the war, attending reunions and sharing memories of their time together in the Pacific darkness. When the war ended in August 1945, the P-61 squadrons faced an uncertain future. Some units remained in the Pacific for several months performing occupation duties and air patrols, but the immediate need for night fighters disappeared with the cessation of hostilities. The aircraft themselves were gradually phased out of service as the Army Air Forces, which would become the independent United States Air Force in 1947, restructured for peacetime operations and began transitioning to jet-powered aircraft. Many P-61s were scrapped or abandoned at remote Pacific bases, their valuable materials salvaged or simply left to deteriorate in the tropical climate. A few were brought back to the United States and used for various test programs or converted for other roles including weather reconnaissance, but the type was largely retired by the late 1940s. Today, only a handful of P-61 airframes survive, with just one, a P-61C named Moonlight Serenade, undergoing restoration to flying condition at the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum in Pennsylvania. The veterans who flew and maintained the Black Widow gradually aged and passed away, taking with them first-hand memories of night combat over the Pacific. Some wrote memoirs or gave interviews documenting their experiences, providing valuable historical records of this relatively obscure aspect of World War II. Organizations like the Night Fighter Association preserved the history and brought veterans together to share their stories. The 418 Night Fighter Squadron specifically was recognized for its achievements, and its lineage was preserved through subsequent Air Force units, maintaining a connection to that original combat formation. The specific mission on which 4 Japanese bombers were destroyed in 80 minutes became a highlight in the squadron's history, cited as an example of perfect execution and the potential of well-trained crews operating advanced equipment. Historians have examined this engagement and similar actions to understand the evolution of night fighting tactics and the impact of radar technology on aerial combat. The P-61 story has been told in books, documentaries, and museum exhibits, though it remains less famous than more numerous types like the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. Nevertheless, among aviation enthusiasts and military historians, the Black Widow holds a special place as an innovative and effective aircraft that pioneered capabilities now taken for granted in modern combat aviation. The P-61's success in the Pacific was part of a broader Allied effort to develop effective night fighting capabilities across all theaters of World War II. In Europe, the British Royal Air Force had been developing night fighter tactics and aircraft since the early war years, driven by the need to counter German bomber raids during the Blitz. Aircraft like the Bristol Beaufighter and later the de Havilland Mosquito, equipped with British-developed AI radar systems, achieved considerable success against German bombers attacking British cities. The Germans themselves developed night fighter forces, particularly the Nachjagd units that defended against RAF Bomber Command's nocturnal raids over Germany. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkers Ju 88, equipped with Liechtenstein radar, shot down thousands of British bombers, though they in turn were countered by electronic warfare measures and the introduction of Allied night intruder missions. This complex night air war over Europe involved sophisticated tactics, cutting-edge technology, and enormous losses on both sides, ultimately contributing to the Allied strategic bombing campaign's mixed results. In the Pacific, the night air war was less intense than over Europe but still significant, particularly in the island hopping campaigns where both sides used darkness to conduct raids against forward bases. The Japanese initially had advantages in this arena through better trained crews and suitable aircraft, but the introduction of the P-61 and other American night fighters reversed the balance decisively. The contrast between the European and Pacific night air wars illustrates how different strategic situations and technological development paths created distinct combat environments. In Europe, both sides invested heavily in night fighting capabilities, creating a technological arms race with frequent innovations and counter-innovations. In the Pacific, Japanese development lagged behind American efforts, leading to the decisive American advantage exemplified by the P-61's success. These different patterns reflected broader trends in the war, with Germany remaining technologically competitive with the Allies almost until the end despite being overwhelmed materially, while Japan fell increasingly behind in technical sophistication as the war progressed. The development of the P-61 and similar night fighters represented one aspect of a broader technological competition that characterized World War II. This conflict saw rapid advancement in numerous fields including radar, jet propulsion, rocketry, nuclear physics, and electronics, driven by the urgent operational needs of combat and the existential stakes of the war. The radar technology that made the P-61 effective emerged from pre-war research in Britain and the United States, then accelerated dramatically once war began. The magnetron, a key component in microwave radar systems, was invented by British scientists in 1940 and shared with the United States, where it was refined and produced in quantity. This collaboration enabled the development of compact, powerful radar systems that could be mounted in aircraft, ships, and ground installations. The SCR-720 radar used by the P-61 represented a midpoint in this technological evolution, more advanced than early systems but primitive compared to what would come after the war. Each side in the conflict tried to develop countermeasures to enemy innovations while simultaneously advancing their own capabilities. The British dropped strips of aluminum foil called window to confuse German radar, while the Germans developed passive radar detectors to home in on British bomber emissions. The Americans built the atomic bomb, while the Japanese developed balloon bombs to attack the United States mainland. This technological competition continued beyond the war's end, directly feeding into Cold War military research and development that produced ICBMs, satellite surveillance, electronic warfare systems, and eventually precision-guided weapons. Many of the scientists, engineers, and military personnel involved in wartime technological development went on to prominent roles in post-war defense industries and government research programs. The organizational models for managing complex technical programs, such as the Manhattan Project and various aircraft development efforts, became templates for subsequent projects. In this context, the P-61 was both a product of wartime innovation and a contributor to the broader pattern of technological advancement driven by military competition. Beneath the technical specifications, tactical analyses, and strategic implications of the P-61's combat record lies the human cost of war that must not be forgotten. Each of the 4 Japanese bombers shot down on that night in summer 1945 carried a crew of 7 to 9 men, meaning that between 28 and 36 human beings died during those 80 minutes of combat. These were not abstract enemies, but individuals with families, hopes, dreams, and lives that were cut short by the violence of war. Many were conscripted personnel who had no choice about their participation in the conflict, simply following orders and trying to survive. Their families back in Japan never learned exactly what happened to them, receiving only notification that they had failed to return from a mission and were presumed dead. The same human cost applied to all the other Japanese aircraft shot down by P-61s throughout the war, with hundreds or even thousands of lives lost. While these losses were militarily justified and contributed to the Allied victory that ended the war, they should not be celebrated without recognition of the tragedy inherent in combat. The American crews who achieved these victories were themselves at risk, flying dangerous missions in aircraft that could suffer mechanical failure or accident even without enemy action. Several P-61s were lost during the war to causes ranging from radar malfunction leading to controlled flight into terrain, to mid-air collisions during bad weather, to simple engine failures over vast expanses of ocean. The crews of these aircraft faced death just as certainly as the enemies they hunted, and some did not survive to see the war's end. The maintenance personnel who worked on the flight line faced different dangers, including accidents with propellers and equipment, tropical diseases, and occasional enemy attack. War extracts costs from everyone involved regardless of which side they serve, and remembering the P-61's story requires acknowledging these costs alongside the technical and tactical achievements. The goal of studying military history should be to learn lessons that might help prevent future conflicts or at least reduce their destructiveness, not simply to glorify combat or celebrate violence.